Hi there, I have a question for you. Are you starting a podcast and perhaps that podcast is going to be all about you interviewing other people? Well, if that's the case, interviewing a guest isn't like doing a job interview and you're going to need to approach it in a completely different way. All of that and more coming up in today's video. Hi, my name is James Mulvaney and I'm founder of podcast.co. And what I wanted to do today is give you a framework that you can follow to make sure you get the absolute maximum out of every single guest that you interview in your podcast, and also make sure that they have an enjoyable interview. So what I'm going to do is give you a 3-step framework to find guests, make sure that they're comfortable, make sure that you're going to get the most out of them, and make sure that every interview you do is absolutely amazing. So firstly, obviously you need to go out and find guests, right? Now, the main thing to do is when you first approach someone about being on your podcast, you need to be direct. Don't be woolly about it, don't dilly-dally around. You need to basically write to them, say, look, I've got a podcast, it has this much traction, and this is why I think it would be a great opportunity for you. Ultimately, you're selling your podcast as a sort of marketing tool for them. So I think going out and actually sort of explaining the benefits is very, very important, but also don't send them like a 2-page introduction. Send them a very short but sweet message saying why they should be on your podcast and the fact that you actually want them to be on your podcast, but be very direct about it. The other piece of advice I have for you is if you use a tool like Matchmaker.fm, if you've not seen Matchmaker.fm, by the way, I'd recommend you go and check it out. It's awesome. It's a fantastic tool to connect guests who are actually looking for interviews with podcasters just like you. And it's free to sign up, so go check it out, matchmaker.fm. I'll put a link in the description below. But however you're going and finding your guests, and I've got another video on this as well, first thing you should try and do with them is, once you've sent your pitch, start with a pre-interview chat. You don't want to jump into bed with them straight away. You need to make sure that you kind of have a bit of an idea who they are, and I think ultimately, before you kind of get this sort of pre-interview chat organised, you need to be flexible about how you're going to schedule it, because you've got to understand most of your guests are going to be busy people. So quite often they'll be founders, they might be CEOs, or people who've got incredibly busy lives. So you need to make sure you're respecting their time firstly. Using tools like Calendly or Harmonizely make it really straightforward to sync your diaries, so you're booking at a time that's mutually beneficial for the both of you. So step number 2 is do your research. Before you go into your pre-interview call, you need to make sure that you're doing at least a little bit of research to find out who your guest is, what their achievements have been, what their journeys look like, and sort of build questions around their experience. You use this pre-interview chat to build rapport. And what I mean by that is, building a relationship with the person. So you're kind of getting a feel for who they are and ultimately what their style is like. Do they speak quickly? Do they speak slowly? Are they very sort of direct in their communication? And potentially look at revising some of your questions before the recording, but at least give them an idea or an outline of what it is you want to talk about. So next up in this framework is the actual recording of the interview. So firstly, we looked at finding guests and actually approaching them. Secondly, we looked at how to communicate with them before the interview and make sure that you've got your questions right and revising your questions. Now it's actually time to get down to it. Now there's 2 types of podcast interview. It's either going to be a face-to-face interview, you might be sat in a studio or going to their office, or you might be recording remotely. Now it's funny because depending on how you're interviewing them, you should really approach this completely differently. There's a different mindset you need to adopt when you're recording an interview face-to-face. Again, if you're recording remotely, completely different mindset. But if it's a physical interview, you're face-to-face, think about the environment, where are you recording? Make sure there's no distractions, make sure your phone's switched off, make sure their phone's switched off. Also, offer them a drink and be patient with them. If they turn up a little bit late, it's not the end of the world, right? If you're recording remotely, make sure you allow plenty of time to not only talk to them beforehand, but then actually do the recording. And perhaps send them an email beforehand just to prepare them. Have they got a USB microphone? Is their computer connected via a cable versus via Wi-Fi? Because all these little things make a big difference when it gets down to remote recording. As I say, you kind of need to adopt a little bit of a different mindset, because I think when you're sat with someone face to face, you can build rapport a lot quicker than if you're just speaking to them down the wire, so to speak. But before you hit that record button, either way, I think it's very important that you at least talk to your guest beforehand. Make sure they're at ease, make sure that kind of you run through it again, because sometimes your pre-interview chat with them might have been a couple of weeks before actually speaking to them. You know, I've even been a guest on podcasts where the pre-interview chat hasn't even been with the person on the podcast, it's been with someone else, which again is sometimes a bit weird because you spoke to one person and suddenly you're speaking to someone different. So your job as the interviewer is to put them at ease and make sure they're feeling as comfortable as possible before you get down to the nitty-gritty. So if that takes 15 minutes, great. If it takes half an hour, great. Just make sure you allow plenty of time to take that person from feeling kind of quite uptight and tense to feeling relaxed and happy that they're going to be doing this interview with you. Sometimes the guests will say stuff before the interview which actually is something you've not considered. Sometimes it's worth writing this stuff down, and there's no harm in bringing it up in the interview. Ultimately, remember to respect the sort of personality of the guest. Remember to respect the message that they're trying to say, and you know, don't put anything in the interview that's going to trip them up too much. But it's quite common to say, oh, you know, before we got started, you know, you mentioned X, and I think this is really interesting. And I think that can sometimes make for an even more interesting interview. Okay, so when it comes down to interview style, I think everyone's got their own approach to this, and there's no right or wrong way of doing an interview. Obviously, remember, you're there to ask questions, I think is first and foremost. Try to keep it informal. You know, you don't want it to sound too old-fashioned or too much just like you're reporting on some kind of really serious news story. So I think one of the key traits of being a good interviewer is actually the ability to listen and be reactive as well as proactive. The difference between the two, so when you're being proactive, you've already got a set of questions that you want to ask, and you've already got a set of outcomes that you're perhaps predicting from that interview that you want to get from that person. You might have sort of covered a lot of this stuff off in the pre-interview chat, but I think being reactive is also very important. And the only way you can really do this is by, you know, truly listening to what they're saying and actually thinking about, you know, how does this relate to the topics that you've kind of described already, and really trying to build a conversation around it. And I think that's when a good podcast can become a great podcast. Now let's talk about going off topic, because I know a lot of people get caught up or worried about, you know, what happens if you go too much off topic. Some of the best conversations and the best podcasts actually come from conversations that weren't too planned. But the important thing to remember is don't derail too much. I've been stuck on podcasts before where I've ended up talking for like an hour and a half about stuff that I wasn't planning on talking because the interviewer has just kind of kept going off and asking me more and more about something. And I'm kind of thinking, you know, I'd only committed an hour to this. Suddenly we're an hour and a half in and we're kind of talking about all sorts of stuff because this guy keeps asking me these random questions. So you've got to remember that ultimately you've got to try and keep the interview on track. But you know, you can afford to meander a little bit, but as I say, just make sure you're not derailing too much. So some other key points to make when you're doing an interview. Make sure that you get the guest to show off their personality. You know, ultimately this interview should be about them, not just about you as the interviewer. It's important to remember that you're not there to restrict the flow of conversation, but make sure you put it back on track if it starts to go south. So next up, I think being brave stands for a lot in an interview. And ultimately, when I say being brave, what I mean is trying to provoke some kind of excitement from their answers. An interview can be too safe, but ultimately as well, we've seen plenty of situations, for example, in the media, where interviewers have pushed the person too far. So it's a real fine line you have to tread between being really safe and boring with your questions and ultimately not getting a very interesting interview versus being sort of too out there. But I think being brave is a good way of putting it. You know, ask some questions that perhaps are going to throw them a little bit, or they're going to provoke an answer that's going to really get the conversation going. All right, so to summarize, firstly, you need to go and find your guests. You need to be direct about how you approach them. You need to be organized and make sure that you're not taking up too much of their time. And ultimately, make sure that you do a really good job of selling why they should be on your podcast and the benefits to them. Step 2 is doing your research. Make sure you know about the guest, who they are, what they've achieved, and you know, to try and find out as much information as you can about that person, and make sure you book a pre-interview chat so you can get to know them a little bit better. So step number 3, recording the podcast. Firstly, invite the guest along, make sure they're comfortable. If it's a face-to-face interview, go and get them a drink and, you know, have a little chat to them before you actually hit that record button. I think that stands for a lot, and I think it helps put the guest at ease. Remember, if you go off on some tangents, it's not the end of the world. However, you need to make sure that you can bring the conversation back on track pretty quickly, because something that you've recorded for 2 hours long is going to be really hard to condense down into 20 or 30 minutes, which is my recommended time for the length of a podcast. Okay, so thanks for watching this video. Hopefully I've given you a good strategy or framework to go out and follow when you're thinking about interviewing guests for your podcast. Now, I want to tell you about Matchmaker.fm. I touched on it a bit earlier. It's a brand new platform that makes it super easy for podcasters and guests to connect. Now, whether you're a guest looking to be featured on more podcasts, or if you're a podcaster looking to book more interesting people for your show, well, Matchmaker.fm is a platform that's basically just like Tinder, but for podcasters. So go and check it out. You can sign up for free today and get started for absolutely nothing. Just connect using your LinkedIn profile. All right, thanks very much for watching this video. Please leave some comments below if you're thinking about starting a podcast. I'd love to know about it, or tell me about your experiences with interviewing guests and how today's conversation is related to it. All right, take it easy and I'll speak to you soon.